warm Bulavanaka here from Suva, Fiji. Welcome to all the panelists, Imrana Jalal, who's currently in Washington, D.C., and Noelene Nabulivou, who's here with us, joining us today at the UN Women Conference Room. Thank you all for participating in the first session of the UN Women Pacific Online Feminist Dialogue Series. We're thrilled to have you all online. As you all know, UN Women turned 10 in July. And so when we were reflecting on the first decade of UN Women's existence, we were, as well as our new circumstances around COVID-19, we thought, how can we honor, the organization? And as the Fiji UN Women multi-country office in the Pacific, we wanted to take the opportunity to create spaces for feminist reflection and discourse, something we often don't, as very busy gender practitioners and feminists, we often don't get the opportunity to do. So this dialogue series has been developed through discussions with partners and is meant to bring together diverse views on key topics that feminists are currently debating and discussing. And we also needed to have a safe space to do that in. So for UN Women in the Pacific, we can think of no better way of honoring our first 10 years than opening up these spaces for feminist analysis and discussion in the Pacific. We've planned this dialogue using an informal talk show Q&A format. Each dialogue session will be moderated by a UN Women staff person with guests who have expertise in the topics. There will be a structured Q&A session with guest speakers followed by open discussion. So thank you once again, panelists and participants, for participating in this first one. Now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the panelists. First, I'll introduce Imrana Jalal. Many of you know Imrana very well. A lawyer by profession, Imrana is currently the chair of the World Bank Inspection Panel, which is an independent accountability mechanism of the World Bank. Imrana has served as a human rights commissioner on the Fiji Human Rights Commission, Fiji Law Reform Commissioner, human rights advisor to the Pacific Regional Rights Resource Team. Imrana is a preeminent expert on Pacific Islands feminist and gender issues and regional law. She's the author of The Law for Pacific Women, a Legal Rights Handbook, architect of the Fiji Family Law Act of 2003, former chair of the UN Committee on Harmful Practices Against Women. She's also a founding member of FWRM, the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, continues to be a member of Women Living Under Muslim Law and the Asia Pacific Forum of Women Law and Development. She also continues to be a commissioner on the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva. She served as Principal Social Development Specialist for the Asia Development Bank, is also a member of UN Women's Global Expert Advisory Group, which guided the production of the 2018 Progress of the World's Women's Flagship Report. Imrana was also appointed recently in June 2020 as the Ombudsperson and board member of Promundo Global. Promundo, as you know, is a global leader in engaging men and boys in promoting gender equality and violence. Thank you so much, Imrana, for agreeing to be in this dialogue series all the way from Washington. Now, I also want to introduce Noelene Nabulivou. Most of you know is a feminist grassroots organizer and educator, feminist researcher, policy analyst, activist, and advocate, and movement builder in Fiji, the Pacific, and globally. Noelene is co-founder and political advisor of Diverse Voices in Action for Equality, which we know as DIVA. DIVA for Equality undertakes grassroots feminist work and co-convenes several networks and coalitions from local to global and back, including the Women Defend the Commons Network. She's also the CSO co-lead of the new Global Action Coalition on Strategies for Climate Justice with UN Women. That also includes the governments of Mexico, France, Costa Rica, and also includes WIDO and the Pan-African Alliance and others. Noelene is also a member of the UNDP Global Civil Society Advisory Committee, the Pacific Gender Technical Working Group on the CSW, the Pacific Gender Coordinating Mechanism, and the Fiji Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights Technical Working Group for the Ministry of Youth and Sports. She has been a global advisor to Mama Cash, to Australia Lesbian Foundation, the Urgent Action Fund, and holds many other movement roles. This year, she was the recipient of the International Women's Health Coalition's Joan B. Dunlop Award for Advocacy. Noelene lives in Suva here with her wife Shirley and their gorgeous 2-year-old Jade. Very warm welcome to you, Noelene. So colleagues, I'm going to be starting off asking Imrana and Noelene a few questions, but just before we begin, like other webinars, you know that you're all used to by now with our new COVID Zoom culture, you will be able to listen in, and of course your microphones are muted to avoid disruptions. However, we do want to hear from everyone. Please, colleagues, use the Q&A function for your questions, but you can also use the chat box for any other comments you may want to make. We're hoping that we will go through some of the questions, then we'll open it up for general Q&A dialogue. And like all other webinars, we'll make sure that this is recorded and shared after the event. So just the first question from me as the moderator. Imrana and Noelene, as specific feminists, you bring a very unique perspective. So grateful for your personal reflections on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls, especially given your roles currently. So I just want to start with you, Imrana, if you could give us your reflections, please. Over to you, Imrana.
Thank you, Sandra. I must start out by saying that I don't speak on behalf of the World Bank. I just wanted to make that clear. I'd like to congratulate UN Women for this great milestone. UN Women has faced so many difficulties in the past in trying to establish itself. And, you know, with the drying up of donor money and so on, I think that there are even more hard battles ahead for all of us in the women's movement. But I just want to say how proud I am of our women's entity, and that we in the global women's movement, feminist and gender equality community continue to support you and renew our commitment to you at this 10th year anniversary. So having said that, let me just say how nice it was to see the F word so boldly emblazoned on your title, feminism. This could not have happened even, I think, 10 years ago, because everybody deliberately avoided using the word feminism because it created so much controversy. So it makes me really proud to see the UN office, Pacific Women UN office, use the word very deliberately. I think it's a very exciting beginning. It's a good time to have this dialogue as we are facing unprecedented hardships, not only for everybody, but especially for women. We all know that when times are tough, when there's a crisis, when there's a disaster, when there's a pandemic, all the inequalities that already exist are exacerbated, and women are the largest group that is impacted by this. Just a few thoughts about some of my concerns in terms of how women are experiencing COVID-19. The first thing for me is, of course, the gender gap in unpaid work. At the moment, for example, in my country, Fiji, there's already a gender gap of 3 to 5 hours a day. This will increase, and women will shoulder even greater burdens of unpaid work. I think women do an average of about 75% of the world's total unpaid care work, including childcare, etc. In some regions like South Asia and the MENA region, women's share of unpaid work is as high as 80 to 90%. So I keep asking myself, if they're already doing that much unpaid work, where is the time going to come from when their family members get sick with COVID-19? Where will that time come from for them to sanitize their homes and their kitchens and their children? So this is something that I think is of great concern. The other, which is my final point for this beginning element of the webinar, I noticed that in most developing countries, and including Fiji and the Pacific, when they talk about job losses, and for example, in Fiji, there are 115,000 people who've lost their jobs in a country of less than 1 million. That's an enormous amount of people, that there's no sex aggregated data. So despite our continuous advocacy and our call for sex disaggregated data, we have not seen this in the recent COVID data. And this is despite the fact that McKinsey Global has just done its research in India and US, and it said that women globally are 1.8 times, almost 2 times more likely to be laid off. So although they make up 39% of the global workforce, they account for 54% of the overall job losses. So this is sobering information, and we need to address this as we go forward. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Imrana. That's excellent, and that really highlights some of the key issues that we've all been facing with COVID-19, and of course the situation in the Pacific has been no different. So I'll hand over to Noelene for her initial reflections. Over to you, Noelene.
Thanks. Thanks, and again, congratulations to you and Women on the 10th anniversary. I always say, I remember when we were in the middle of the GEAR campaign just over 10 years ago, and many Pacific feminists were part of that work, so we really feel like this is our anniversary too. Maybe just to start off with a couple of key points that, you know, as Imrana's raised, this is not about just a health crisis. It's, you know, impacting on women and girls and LGBTQI people, gender non-binary people and men and everyone, on our bodies, on our resources, on finance, trade, whether it's the micro, meso or macroeconomics piece. It's impacting on our health and education, the justice system, whether people can still have access to the justice system in all its fullness, you know, with all its gaps, and politics, civil systems, and disaster response. So there's all kinds of things. The transport system, for instance, even being able to move around the country. Then we also have the entire care economy, the impacts both on paid and unpaid care work, but also things like freedom of movement and on levels of surveillance, whether it's the offline surveillance, you know, keeping more of an eye on civil society, or whether it's digital and online. So that's happening a lot more as well. Social floor, social protection, and social infrastructure is all affected. Then there's the physical deaths, and which look different in different countries of the Pacific. We have Guam, who has many more deaths than we do. I think we've had 2 deaths, but tens that have been ill. And then for us, it's the borders being completely closed, and the effects that has on both freight and regular travel. And what we do about things like repatriation and special circumstances in terms of travel. But also that people all around the Pacific right now, governments and peoples are trying to make those balanced decisions between economics and health and other types of, and what process is used to make those decisions is really important right now. And that's a gendered process, but it's also about issues of inequality and ability to influence national processes. And I guess maybe the last couple I'd raise is just the effects on the national economy. I don't know if I'm online. Am I online? Or? Yeah, effects on the national economy and on specific sectors. And, you know, the bottom has really fallen out of our tourist sector, and we have to be real about the level of pain that's felt by everyone within the tourism sector. And it's also those larger geopolitical issues. So things like we're already in a time when we're negotiating with the EU on post-Cotonou agreements on sugar. So this is all happening in that, you know, in that time period. We also have issues of fisheries that we're trying to deal with right now and make sure that, you know, we've lost 90% of our large fisheries within the oceans. How do we make sure that that remaining 10% is cared for, and that the decisions aren't being made now without due process because we're in the middle of a pandemic? And that leads me to my last point, which is things around debt regimes. We know that we have to be careful now about countries servicing debt at the expense of all of those social provisions that we require. And some of those economic decisions might be being made without taking into account gendered and social and all those other decisions that we have to think through. I think I'll leave it at that for now and carry on later. Thank you.
Thank you. I think both of those responses give such an excellent summary of the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls, the increased gap, the increased burden on women, the lack of ability or of ensuring that women in all of their diversities are included in decision-making spaces, and some of the really keen economic decisions that need to be made, and who's at the table making them. And that segues nicely into the next question, which is for Imrana. So Imrana, given your global role, I really welcome your thoughts on women in leadership in response to COVID-19. We've all seen comments and analysis online about some of the countries that have performed best in responding to COVID-19, and some of those have been headed by women. New Zealand being one example, but also Taiwan, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Finland, Germany. We've also seen some of the recovery plans, in particular the state of Hawaii's Feminist Economic Recovery Plan. What do you think makes women and feminists better able to respond to a crisis such as COVID-19? And welcome any examples that you have of government or even agency actions that have been taken that ensure women's voices are more included in response and recovery to COVID-19. Over to you, Imrana.
Thank you, Sandra. So I think it's not just women's leadership per se that makes a difference, but I would argue feminist leadership, which by definition means inclusive leadership. And one of the things I've most admired about people like Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel is how they openly identify them as feminists and identify themselves as feminist, which is something that they probably couldn't have done even 10 years ago. So why do women make better leaders in situations like this? So first of all, I think it almost comes from our natural sort of the kind of stereotype roles that have been imposed on us. So we're better at handling multiple roles at once. We juggle many balls in the air. Also, those roles are often contradictory and they seem to collide with each other, being pulled in many directions, whether it's work, life, childcare, domestic responsibilities, etc. You know what? It's given me a bit of a giggle because women have been told for years that we are too emotional to make objective decisions, especially in a crisis. But what did women do in the crisis? The women leaders that you've mentioned, they turned to science, not emotions, to come up with solutions for the pandemic. So I think that women bring these very important inclusive values to emergency decision making, whether it's a disaster or pandemic. So the first thing I would say is that they make evidence-based decisions. They look to the experts. They listen to the science when, in comparison, many male leaders of really, really powerful big countries overnight became scientists themselves, relying on their gut instincts. You know, and so this, I think, stands in stark contrast to someone like Merkel, who is herself a scientist. So she relies on science to make a proper decision, as does Ardern. The second thing is, I really genuinely think that they all put the collective good over their own political self-interest. And when I think about the male leaders who have focused mainly on political self-interest, it's very worrisome. So the women leaders knew how to be empathetic and at the same time to be decisive. So I think that this is a very important point. And, you know, it goes without saying that the qualities that we typically associate with leadership, for example, being assertive, competitive, confident, dominant, independent, these are all qualities associated with male leaders. But actually what happened in the crisis is the women's qualities became critical to making proper decisions. So what did women leaders bring to the table? They brought their humility. Ardern has said several times, I looked to the experts. I looked at what the scientists said, and then I took my advice from them. I included them in the collective decision-making. They brought compassion, and this has been very obvious by a number of leaders, not just Jacinda. They thought about our children as well as their children. They brought cooperation and collaboration. So those skills, those values that are looked down on for leadership, in fact, I think in the pandemic, they are emerging as the greatest strengths of leadership today. So maybe this will give our government pause. Maybe they will think more, I mean, not just my government, but all our governments pause in the Pacific. So I say this while acknowledging how disappointed I was. So the Fiji Women's Rights Movement recently did a survey to look at board membership in Fiji. They looked at 38 boards to see what percentage of women are on boards in Fiji. So in these 38 boards, of 189 members, only 20% were women. And if you separate the boards into commercial, state-owned enterprise and commissions, the figure's even more dismal. And what really shocked me is that in this era, in this day and age, with a commitment to the SDGs, 45% of boards in Fiji don't even have a single woman on them. So even though we talk about gender equality, we talk about leadership, these are platitudes unless they are operationalized. And we need to mandate by law. You asked what can we do? We need to mandate by law the inclusion of women in leadership. For example, if you look at Malaysia, Malaysia has a quota of 30% minimum women. So we might have to go along this line. I'm a great believer in quotas. Now that I've worked in 2 banks, international development banks, nothing changes unless you have a specific quota. So my final point is, I think rather than suggesting piecemeal changes, I think really, and I know this, feminist economists have been saying this for years, one would hope that there's actually a new global world order that will emerge from one based on masculinity. And I say this while recognizing the unlikelihood of maledom ceding power. And I say this recognizing that it's not necessarily a male versus female thing, and that the anti-feminist order is perpetuated by both men and women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imrana. That was excellent. And I think a lot of the attributes and qualities that feminists bring to the table, the ability to be collective, to be empathetic, to put egos aside and turn to the experts and make sure that decisions are made to the collective good. I think a lot of those qualities did resonate. Absolutely. And talking about the new world order as well, and looking at what qualities do we want in leadership across the board, and what can feminism, bring in terms of leadership there. And that leads also well to the next question, which is for Noelene. Oxfam really recently published 5 reasons why the coronavirus needs a feminist response. Thank you, Oxfam. I think it's excellent. Oxfam stated that feminism has already developed the ideas that can now close the existing gap of inequality, which becomes even more obvious in a time of crisis. So Noelene, given your experience as a feminist and activist at the global and community levels, what in your view are some of those feminist principles that we can take forward to policymakers and that can influence and better drive economic and social responses to the impacts of COVID-19?
So I think what Imrana's just been speaking about, and what I'd like to then extend, is it's not just about the principles that arise out of feminist praxis, it's about the praxis itself. So it's about the, the knowledge systems that arise from feminist work. It's about the epistemologies, the concepts, the ideas, and the framing that enables you to go into the world and to work and to move in a particular kind of way. And then to work out how you work with others to take forward that work. So it's about the strategies and tactics as well. So one of the, there's a few key points that I wanted to raise, and one of them is that we know now from our decades of work and longer women's movements before that about the need to really emphasize embodied human rights, about the need to think about issues of bodily autonomy and integrity. It's really in the heart of the work. How is it that we make decisions over all of the territories of body and life and all the texture of our everyday life if we don't have the ability and the freedom to be able to make decisions? So that's one. Then it's the non-siloing, and there's a wonderful set of work by Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, for over 30 years that looks at issues of interlinkage analysis and allows us really to look at the many aspects of an issue, whether it's about sexual and reproductive health and rights, whether it's about political economy and globalization, whether it's political restructuring and social transformation, or political ecology and sustainability. When you're able to look at one issue from many kinds of angles, it both allows many people to come into the work, but it also allows you to drill down into what it is about that set of work. And I think feminists do that very well now. The intersectionality piece of the work is really important, and it's come out, and it's really important to talk about the trajectory of this work. It comes out of black women's movements and indigenous peoples and people of color. And those sets of work around how do we negotiate power. All of us, whoever it is that we're talking about, have many different parts to our identity, and that negotiation of power within those identities and between them is what really is where we can find the humanity and find ways that we can work together on what seems like insurmountable problems. But we really can if we find those ways in from our different parts of who we are. The next one is really recognizing multiple forms of knowledge. Not just saying everything I come to, you know, we really need different kinds of technical experts, whether it comes from embodied knowledge from the earth, whether it comes from those who are working in academia and civil society and UN agencies all over. We need those multiple forms of knowledge. What COVID-19 has allowed us to do is it's really exposed, I think, many of the lies and half-truths that have come through a very unequal economic system, a neoliberal capitalist system, and all of those financial and development institutions that prop up the worst parts of those systems. So for us, it's about saying, what are those people who actually showed up during the frontline struggles of COVID? It was those many paid and unpaid care workers, whether it was the retail operators, through to car wash attendants, through to everybody, health workers, everyone who was part of that. It really wasn't those who came from outside or were doing it from air-conditioned offices, I have to say. And there's many of us who are part of that system. And I think we have to think that through, that the issues around, really starting to look at those who truly are holding up the system and are helping it to run. Those are who should be served by the development state. And I think that feminists in leadership, whatever kind of leadership it is, not just in the state, but in the non-state areas, they're starting to re-look at the state and say, this is about being for development, for the people. And how do we do that in a way that truly is for everyone, where we leave no one behind? We say the words all the time, but how do we make it about that? The last one I'd say is, if we are really interested in change, then feminist principles and practice says we have to do both the material and the structural work. It's all part of the same body of work. So it has to be a change in the daily, everyday lives of women and people, and also the deeper systemic change.
Thank you so much, Noelene and Imrana, both for your answers. I think you've tied in a lot of the concepts around feminism, where we, are focusing on multiple forms of knowledge, the intersectionality, also being respectful of bodily autonomy of our own and others, and all of these, really questioning the current structures and systems that are in place and building towards new ones. Moving on, though, just looking at also the impact of COVID-19 on feminist movement building as well. So the next question is for you, Imrana. You're a working mom, you're one of the most senior civil servants in the world, a feminist who I know never backs down from a challenge. What do you think of this quote by Helen Lewis? She wrote in the Atlantic magazine, she said, "Coronavirus is a disaster for feminism." And she wasn't just talking about, the gap or the added burden. She was also talking about the feminist movement globally. So are there ways that COVID-19 has impacted feminism as a movement globally and in the Pacific? And what can we do to mitigate this? Over to you, Imrana.
Thank you, Sandra. So, I would say that up until the COVID crisis in March, when we all started to work from home, women had made so many gains in the law, in the labor market, in education, in all sectors of human endeavor. We made so many gains, and now with this crisis, so many of those gains are going to be rolled back. So it's a gargantuan task to even think about what it's going to do to the women's movement. So, you know, even things like Noelene mentioned, the issue of human rights, that now human rights are in great danger of being, you know, shunted aside, because now people are, you know, tightening their fiscal belts. Countries are tightening their fiscal belts. Even, I mean, I mentioned earlier on this issue about donor money. I mean, where is the money going to come from to help us do the work that we've been doing as feminists? And I know that we shouldn't rely on donor money, but we do. That is the reality, you know. So there will be a lot of rolling back of these gains. We've already seen people say, don't worry about human rights. Listen, this is a crisis. We don't have time for human rights. That's a luxury. So, and women's rights are subsumed under that. So I think that many of these rights that we've taken for granted will be rolled back, and that we have to be careful and vigilant to make sure that it doesn't happen in the way that it seems to be contemplated. So, you know, if you're looking at the different sectors within the women's movement, then, you know, of course, you know, one major concern is what happens to the women who do subsistence farming for food. Their burden will increase as men are laid off their jobs. The labor market is already highly gendered. With less income coming in, and women are going to have to work even longer hours at subsistence farming to put food on the table. So I think the lesson in that is invest more in food security. Women's work has always attracted lower wages. It's time to change that. Another obvious one, which I'm sure is on everybody's minds everywhere, is the increase in gender-based violence. We know this from hotlines all over the world. Even in developed countries like the US, there's been a massive increase in women seeking advice and support from crisis hotlines. So to me, a lesson from this is we need to listen more to the women's crisis centers globally. We need to change laws, and we need to allocate resources, but we need to particularly focus, I think, on prevention measures. So more resources are needed for prevention measures and gender-based violence. The other issue that I think is worth thinking about more is women's health and safety. And the example that immediately comes to mind is that women form a significant percentage of healthcare workers, not just in the US, but everywhere. So within the health sector globally, women comprise about 75% of the workforce. So 75% of healthcare workers are women. In the Western Pacific, it's even more at 81%, despite the fact that these sectors traditionally attract low wages. But these care workers are indispensable as contributors to the delivery of healthcare services. And they are often, they look after other people at enormous risk to their own health and safety. And they often are not able to even look after their own children because they're looking after ours, or they're looking after our parents or our families. So, you know, I know that we say this, it's become like a trite comment, but really they are the true heroines of the world. So women, because of the disproportionate number that they are in the health workforce, they face a disproportionate risk of contracting infectious diseases like COVID-19. So in terms of the advances that we've made in the labor market, again, this is going to be rolled back because of COVID-19. And of course, there are other issues that have been coming to the forefront, things like women's reproductive health issues, something as basic as access to sanitation, access to contraceptives. What does that mean for women who are not able to control their own fertility? So these are some of the important emerging issues that we're going to have to deal with as a global feminist movement. And of course, the other one that you know, is probably in a lot of people's minds, and that's the issue of mental health issues and women having to bear the burden of care in that regard. So if I was asked, you know, what's my wish list, what's my menu of what a feminist world would look like in the times of COVID-19, I would say, well, first of all, we need to do a very good macro analysis of feminist macro analysis of economics. So I hear what Noelene is saying. Of course, I work for an institution that is part of that sector that is both the solution and can be both the solution as well as the problem. The second point I would say, in terms of a feminist world, is All leadership positions would consist of 50% women. It would be based on inclusivity and not survival of the fittest, with the strongest and the biggest and the largest economies and the militarized countries calling the shots. They decide what the current world economic order looks like, and that needs to change. It would focus more on human security and our socio-economic well-being, instead of the traditional militaristic and forceful approach, for example, to national security. There'd be flexible and pragmatic policies based on science, as I said before, with long-term perspectives, instead of prioritizing ideology and public posturing and national political considerations. It would be more inclusive of the developing world. One thing that struck me recently was how so many of the rich countries went out and bought up all the potential medicines for COVID, and they basically cornered the market. So what happens to us who come from poor and developing countries? Who's going to look after our interests if the rich and militarized countries with lots of money and large economies are not inclusive about us? And of course, my final point is about diverse, inclusive and equitable leadership and decision-making, input from marginalized communities, transparency, flexibility, and a willingness to admit mistakes instead of finger-pointing and face-saving. So I think that if we put all these points together, we could come up with solutions together as the developed world and the developing world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imrana. I love that list. I think it's a very, very excellent and comprehensive list. Fantastic. Last and final question I'm going to give to Noelene. So the feminist author Arundhati Roy stated about COVID-19. She wrote, "The tragedy is immediate, real, epic, and unfolding before our eyes. But it isn't new. It is the wreckage of a train that has been careening down the track for years." She was referring to how COVID-19 has exposed the inequalities within societies, not in her home country, India, but also across the globe. Yeah. How, in your view, has COVID-19 exposed those inequalities, both globally and specifically in the Pacific? And as feminists, how can we ensure to close those gaps post-COVID or throughout the period of COVID? What's your list, like Imrana's list?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that we're not post anything, including COVID-19. And that means also putting this pandemic in the context of, you know, sometimes it feels right now as if there's still a narrative around it being a temporary inconvenience, and there's even this narrative of build back better and things like that. But really what this is, to most feminists, is that it's part of a wider, deeper civilizational crisis, and it's about socioeconomic and ecological dimensions, and that brings in the whole climate change set of work that we're all doing as well. So when you consider it like that, there are some deeper underlying issues that we have to address, and we don't have the luxury of being able to pick and choose. These are systemic sets of issues that are interconnected. So one of the bright lights that I see, maybe only a flickering one, is that some of those development proposals that we've seen rejected by states offhand, and many development experts, are actually being revisited. So we see a lot more discussion around non-conditional cash transfers. We see discussions of the universal income payments. We see critiques of agribusiness, and people are doing that because they're looking at the zoonotic nature of pandemics. They're saying, oh, we really have been cutting some of the regulations, maybe on agribusiness and pharmaceuticals, big pharma, that we shouldn't have been doing. Now, is that deeply embedded in the States now? No, but at least there is a discussion in a way that we haven't seen over decades, except perhaps in kind of heterodox economics and other spaces. And then the second thing that I see happening quite a lot more now is that we are willing, as both states and non-state actors, to look more deeply into agroecology and organic agriculture and aquaponics, and doing it in a way that really might have teeth, that we can look at it at scaling up, but also doing it in a deeper, more ecological way. And then that links to the next one, which is, it is not about just mass tree planting. We're seeing that by the millions and the billions now, and we're doing that because of COVID as well as climate change. We're looking at the state of our ecosystems. But that means we have to do rewilding work. We have to do reforesting. We have to do permaculture and biodiversity work. It's a much deeper set of work than just let's go plant 1 million trees. And the next thing that we're seeing a lot of interest in is in the defense of the commons and commoning. So really looking at what are those things that every single human being and other species, which by the way, we're driving into extinction at around 200 a day, right? So it's 1,000 times more than the usual extinction rate. So if we're doing that as humans, what are we now doing to help this work on commoning? Not seeing it as some externality in economics, but saying you cannot have an economics that works without changing the way that we do ecological commoning, right? We can't do that. And then the next thing that we're doing is really saying, what does a recuperation of the development state look like in law and in practice? What are those laws and policies that need to shift now because of where we are? We know, for instance, that public and private partnerships don't work in certain areas. We cannot have privatized health systems. We saw in the COVID response to date that they don't have an answer. It is public health systems that have the answer. How good and how systematized and how localized and how geographically spread, that's the real question of whether communities and societies can come through a pandemic okay. So I think that some of that repair and restructuring of the development state is really, really important. And the last 2 points are, you know, we really do, and thank you, Imrana, for saying that. I'd rather you were in there than just about many other, people I know, but we do have to look at the structure, the effects of the structural adjustment policies that we've seen by the IMF and the World Bank in the past. They eroded some of our post-independence gains, and we want those back. And we want to be able to recuperate that and have a deeper democratization of our states. Whether it's austerity or it's stimulus packages doesn't matter. If it's done that in a way that is not about social and economic and ecological justice, it's not going to work for the peoples of the world. So we have that problem and we have the patriarchal problem. That means we have to look at the epidemic levels of sexual and gender-based violence. We have to look at how care is just sat on the bodies of women for millennia and how we're going to shift that. That means changing the gender norms. That means stopping this sanctioning of women's bodies and really stopping the levels of sexual and gender-based violence that we have against all people, no matter what gender they are. And then really what we're doing is saying our COVID response has to be ongoing and it has to deal with the economic realities in a development justice frame. And the last thing I'd say is we need a debt moratorium. There is no way that countries can keep paying debt as well as do all of the work they need to do. So one of the things that's been put forward is really saying maybe we need a suspension of the World Trade Organizational trade practices right now, because what we need to do is focus on how we're going to get people back to health and invest in the development state. We need to decarbonize the economy. And the last point I'd say is whatever viral vaccine or treatment modality that we come out with for COVID has to be universal, it has to be localized, it has to be public, it can't be about intellectual property. We've already done that and it doesn't work, and we have to find a public way forward for us, not just in health, but in social, economic, and ecological justice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Noelene. That was a really, really comprehensive response as well. And I think, excellent points around relooking how we're, especially in the extractive industries and in agriculture, what are we doing, in terms of making sure that our environmental practices are sustainable, yep, building that into our economic responses and our economic systems, and looking at preservation of the commons, for example. These things are often, again, wiped away as if they're not valuable, in the same way that women working in the care economy are not invested or supported and paid a real salary. So these are all incredibly important points. Now, we've got some questions through the Q&A box. We've got a question for Imrana. One of the questions is, do you think these qualities of leadership, empathy, humility, adapting to problems, are also the result of the higher standard women in leadership positions are held to as compared to male leaders who are more likely to fail up? Imrana, welcome your thoughts on that question.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, actually. I think that's partially correct, but not totally correct, remembering that these qualities have actually been looked down upon as leadership qualities. They are not traditionally things that people respect leaders for. But on the other hand, I absolutely agree with you that women are held up to a higher standard than men. But fortunately, it's not that hard for us to do better. So thank you.
Thanks, Imrana. Good response. Now we've got a question for Noelene from Yvonne Underhill-Sem, who many of us know. Welcome, Yvonne. Thank you for sending in a question. Given the significance of feminist principles and practices, embodied, interlinked, intersectional, diversity, inclusive, how can we ensure feminist research is also considered expertise? Noelene.
Thank you, Yvonne. That's a huge question, I think, actually, because it really goes to the point that I tried to make earlier, which is it's really about multiple forms of knowledge, and it's about honoring multiple forms of knowledge. And what does that actually look like? Beyond the recognition, how then do you make it useful for different kinds of people throughout the community? Because the thing is, from my understanding, research is looking at something anew. It is looking at something in a different, that's what research is really ultimately about. And so one of the examples that we've had is we spent 4 years doing a participatory set of research by DIVA for Equality. And we were told in the beginning by many people that we shouldn't do it and we couldn't do it. And for a group of grassroots LGBTQI activists in the Pacific, that can either stop you or it can make you determined to come up with a new set of imaginings about research. So we tried to go with that. And we've come out with a set of research that now is available online. And the first thing I would say about that is, it is also about how much research, both the content and the methodology, is shared online. If it is only about sitting within an academic environment, that can be problematic if there aren't issues of availability for the general public. There is something specific for that in feminist research, which is about making sure that those with whom you research are part of the actual process. One of the questions I was asked recently was, how do you feel about external researchers? And one of the things is, no one wants to be studied like they're an insect. No one. And that means that we have to re-articulate and reimagine the ways that we research. I have many times when I'm asked to fill in questionnaires, endless questionnaires every month, and I will never see those researchers again. So it's also about being extractivist in your research. What is the opposite of that is to make sure that you already have existing trusted relationships where you can work with the people who are in the communities, but also that you're engaging as so-called technical experts and have an ongoing relationship with them past the initial research, so that you're moving into the gap between research and advocacy. So I think that's another one. The next thing is about knowledge generation and sharing, is about articulations of power. It's about saying, in the end, who has the right to say whether research is legitimate or not? Who has the right to speak? Who has the right to write about me? Is it checked that I agree with what you have written about me? So all of these deeper questions of power and control are also very much part of the politics of research. So I think feminists have been really good at articulating the politics of research. And as Yvonne knows, I think we have to think about who is a woman researcher, who is a feminist researcher, who is a Pacific Islander, who is not, and where does the internal and the external come together. Sometimes there's a very good reason to work with someone outside the immediate geographic area, but you've got to be very clear that you've built in those discussions about how do the people who are most giving to that research, how will they take away from it? So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Noelene. That's an excellent response. And I think many of us in the Pacific We get visited often by researchers and consultants. I used to
Yes.
laugh that it was one of the biggest extractive industries.
Yes.
Thanks. We've got another question also for both of you, really. It's a general question, and it's about the feminist considerations for the rise of digital platforms and the resulting digital inequalities as seen during this COVID time. And certainly, I know we've talked about this a lot in the Pacific. There is in terms of the women's movement, some people are online and are active and engaged, and some people are not. And in the Pacific, in the feminist movement, we've often brought people together, in order to have discussions and make plans moving forward. So, Imrana, in your view, what are some of the feminist considerations for the rise of digital platforms and the resulting digital inequalities as seen in this COVID time?
Thank you, Sandra. I'm not sure you've sent that question to the right person, but let me have a go. Definitely, there's a significant gender divide between access to even things like phones, right? Although we know that mobile phones have also played an enormous role in empowering women, whether it's from digital banking to a range of other things. So, obviously things like access to platforms and so on are a critical thing. I don't know how that can be changed in the developing world, where we are grappling with simple things like access to food and masks and medicine for COVID and so on. I think that it is critical, but I don't quite know how to solve that problem. And even in situations where women have access to digital technology, that is often controlled by men. And I'm thinking about those two Pakistani girls who videoed themselves dancing in the rain and how they were killed by their male family members. So, you can have these extreme sort of consequences of women having access to the digital technology. So all I can say is that I recognize that there is a gender digital divide, and that up until COVID, there was a lot of work being done. For example, the Asian Development Bank had a massive project in Myanmar, which was all about giving access to technology, and that included helping 30,000 women entrepreneurs. So, those sorts of initiatives, I'm wondering where will they go now that we are grappling with even more basic issues like food, shelter, health, and water. So I think I'll stop there. Maybe Noelene will have a more valiant attempt at that.
Oh, I don't know about that. Okay, so I'd say, I've been thinking a lot about feminist use of the internet. There's a wonderful set of work called the Feminist Principles of the Internet that people can find their way to, and some brilliant I think it's called Take Back the Tech, which is another set of feminist groups on this. The internet and social media are tools, and they amplify and they reflect the world back to us anyway. So all of those issues of inequalities and injustice and gender-based oppression we find on the internet. But the other issue that I think is really heavy on my mind right now is about we already have a differential in access for urban poor, rural, and maritime-based women here in the Pacific. And when we're thinking about how we connect with those women and how we do our work, if we say that we are interested in democratization of the state, such as it is, then we have to be really interested in how is this COVID-19 changing the direct kind of work that we do with women, and what are we trying to substitute it with if we're not able to move within those different spaces. Because let's talk about Zoom. I mean, Zoom and webinars and the timing of them, it's not just within the Pacific, but when you're expected to do that with New York and Geneva and others and Washington, and all of us are trying to do this in a way that is human, it can be a very dehumanizing process for women in general. Then when you have to move through at least 2 to 3 steps to even get on the Zoom platform.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen today some of the technical problems that even those of us with a lot of access have. And then if someone is saying to us, okay, grassroots women, how do we get them into a CSW process or a Beijing process? We have to think really carefully. Is it even possible to do that within the existing kinds of technology? And it's so expensive still for data, to buy data, particularly in the Pacific and in any majority South country. And I think one of the solutions is to really hold against it where it starts to be used as a substitute for real dialogue and activism. Be prickly, question and speak up, and try to find those feminist alternatives and those heterodox alternatives, because it is about privilege and power, and it just exacerbates some of the problems. We really should be worried that the digital divide will get greater, just as we're worried about now, seeing some of the first regression in numbers of girl child in schools and other things that are happening in terms of COVID. So it's one of those areas we have to really watch now, I think.
No, thank you. Thank you both for those answers. Absolutely. The digital divide has become super pronounced in COVID-19, and we can see that in the Pacific. We're having less engagement, less interaction, and really we're trying to make sure that people have access and are able to participate online, but the platforms themselves, are very inhibiting. Even these Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars are inhibiting, and they inhibit sometimes that real dialogue. Absolutely right. So we've got time for just one more question. I think this is from Diane Reddy, and this is for Imrana, but also Noelene. It's really about, Imrana, your examples of women's, the percentages of women on Fiji boards, from the work that FWRM, the research FWRM has done. It's quite shocking that we have such a high percentage of boards that don't even have a single woman on them. So where is the opportunity, for women in leadership in Fiji post-COVID and in our future existence? How are we going to really progress that in Fiji, and I would say the rest of the Pacific, of getting women into leadership roles across the board, on boards as well as other leadership positions? Welcome your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Sandra. Well, look, I know, well, first let me say this about democracy. The question from Dinah, I think you said, it almost answers its own question. It is critical that we strengthen our democratic institutions and we strengthen our democracies. And that means having more women in the legislature, on the boards, whether in the private sector or the public sector. All of these are critical. We can't ignore the fact that the more women we have in Parliament, in fact, the studies show very clearly that the numbers of women in Parliament have a direct impact on social security concerns, on social protection, on childcare, etc., etc. So the research is clear. The more women you have in Parliament, the more gender inclusive policies, programs, budgets you have. So I agree with you, our democracies need to be strengthened. But I want to come back to my earlier point about quotas. Now, a lot of people don't like quotas. They think it makes women look weak and so on. But I'd like to remind all of us, and I'd like to remind you and myself, that in fact, it's not a level playing field in the first place. If it was a level playing field, then women would not need quotas. But as long as it's not a level playing field, I think quotas are the best way. Again, the Interparliamentary Union has shown how quotas actually give women the opportunity to experience leadership, and then once they've been in Parliament for a few years, they then can compete on their own terms. But I'm a great supporter of quotas because I think the studies have shown clearly that they do make a difference, and I would suggest that Pacific Island governments start with a quota of at least 20%, and they should be aiming for 50% by 2030, 2040. And not just in terms of boards, but also a quota in Parliament. And we all know how we've tried so hard to get legislation passed in various countries. It's only been successful in a few to have quotas for women in Parliament. So I'm a great believer in quotas, and I think I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Imrana. Noelene?
I just add that agree with everything Imrana said, but just say that the numbers of women that we put forward, we're already doing that. We've tried to do it through the Women's Forum here. There's many groups that are working on that. We've also, we're working really hard in the women's movement and you know, UN Women and many others on accompaniment of women, serious accompaniment of women, because it's one thing, you know, to speak to women and say, okay, you will be part of the wider mainstream decision-making body, but being in a room with patriarchs, even benevolent ones, men who are used to taking up the space in a room, that is a very difficult thing to do when all your life you have been told not to do that. And that requires not just workshop, it requires serious networking, constituency building, so that women feel like they have those behind them when they walk into a small, a medium, or a large room, whatever the room is. And I think lastly that if the state is now saying some things around this issue, but if you are serious as a government, as a state, wherever you are, including in Fiji, then you will look at the issue of quotas, because you are determined to make sure that the equity happens. If you don't have that, I think it shows that you truly aren't serious in addressing some of those long gaps and obstacles, and changing the spaces and the processes. If you really want women to be able to function well and to be healthy and happy within those board spaces, and you want our ideas, then be prepared to be challenged. Don't be so worried about whether someone will not be a yes person or won't say it in the way that you wish to hear it. I think that we've got to all be a lot more open to hearing multiple points of view. It makes our democracy healthier. So the question to ask then is, do we want a healthy democracy or do we not?
Thank you. Thank you, Noelene. I think that's an excellent point to sum up the whole discussion. We've run out of time, colleagues, so we won't be taking any more questions. Oh, we've got, maybe we'll just take one more. Can we allow one more? This is from Diana Borisova. Thank you, Diane. It's to Noelene, and it's about international trade. So Diana was saying she works in international trade law, and how the law can be used.
Then you should answer it. Yeah.
How the law can be used to create policy cohesion between international trade law, trade, and public health outcomes. And she's questioning your suggestion to suspend WTO trade rules, or maybe she wasn't correctly capturing your suggestion.
Yeah.
But maybe you can explain a bit more by what you meant by applying feminist framing.
Yeah, so all I'm saying is, Diana, and I'd love to have a discussion about this. Maybe there's a room for a webinar on this. I think there is an upcoming women in economic empowerment issue. But in terms of making sure that we already, as small island states, have difficulties in ensuring that we have adequate presence and political power to negotiate within these spaces, whether it is at the UN, whether it is at the World Trade Organization, whether it is in the various other World Bank processes, whatever it is. So if we know that that is already a problem, then one of the issues that we're trying to think through as feminists right now is, how do we ensure that in this time in COVID-19, where we can't even have those correct meetings in the way that we have been able to negotiate, and we all know how difficult that has been, to even get the slimmest of provisions in order to make sure that small island states, least developed countries and others have enough fiscal, economics and political power to truly be players in that huge game that is this world trade system. So the issue that we're trying to think through right now, and there's a feminist gender and trade coalition that's thinking through these issues, and I can put you onto that, is can we truly do that right now, or should we suspend it until we are able to have negotiations that truly can see AOSIS and LDCs and other countries come in the fullest of their power, even knowing that that's not enough? When you're going up against China and Brazil, all the BRICS, and you're going up against the US right now that's doing all it can to break down the multilateral system. So that's about being careful whether TRIPS and TRIM and others can truly be negotiated properly right now. That's why there's also a global movement right now around debt moratoriums. There's a whole Jubilee debt moratorium process right now because, and I believe, Imrana, that the World Bank and IMF have suspended those debt repayments. The problem is that the private sector repayments aren't being suspended now. And that's where the huge money is. And that's where the state and investor dispute settlements are right now. So if countries aren't even able to function properly, how are they going to negotiate in the best possible way with a large corporation? It really is virtually impossible. So that's really what I was talking about in terms of finding a heterodox or feminist or progressive form of trade resolution right now. It's very difficult. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, both Noelene and Imrana. I know both of you are incredibly busy women, so it's been an absolute pleasure to have you both as panelists. Imrana, thank you so much for linking on from Washington. It's been so great to see you and hear you again. Just fantastic. I know that I have the task of trying to sum this up. I think it's an absolutely gargantuan task, but if I could just even try, I think what we've talked about for the last hour, you know, we highlighted the fact that COVID has exacerbated inequalities. It's opened the cracks, and we can see the inequalities emerge. The pay gaps, the increased burden of care, the increases in domestic violence, the increase in lack of access to services, health services, justice. We've seen that those countries that have invested in a care economy have done much better than those countries that haven't. And then we talked a lot about the feminist qualities of leadership that made those countries that employed those feminist qualities a lot more able to serve their public in terms of both, you know, getting healthcare out, but using science and using empathy and inclusivity in their decision-making styles. We also talked about, you know, the fact that we need more women in leadership positions because they bring those skills and qualities to the leadership positions, and that we're still a long way from that. And Imrana gave the examples of women in boards in Fiji. We also talked about how COVID-19 has impacted our freedoms, our freedom of movement, but also our freedom to engage, our freedom to be part of decision-making entities, and the impact that has on us as feminists, on our bodily integrity, and our ability also to come as feminists to developing solutions, because we're used to looking at things through an intersectional lens, and we're used to engaging multiple forms of knowledge in our responses. We also talked a lot about the impacts both on women, but also on the environment, and that, you know, states are looking for easy solutions to address this economic crisis. And the easy solutions are things like, well, keep exploiting the environment and keep increasing those inequalities, which of course, you know, are those cracks that we were talking about. So that's my very brief attempt at summing up what has been quite an incredible and rich discussion. I want to thank Noelene and Imrana again for this, and all of you participants online, and thank you for the excellent questions. This is the start of a series, so we will be having another feminist dialogue in September, towards the end of September, on women's economic empowerment. And we're asking our questions, ourselves the question, do we have the right approach to women's economic empowerment? And in October, to celebrate the 75th year of the UN, we'll be also talking about, can the UN deliver a feminist future? So we have two exciting dialogues coming up. We welcome everybody to continue to join in. And just handing back to Imrana and Noelene for any last words. Imrana, over to you.
Okay, I wasn't expecting any last words. I think I've kind of exhausted everything that I can say, really. It's so wonderful to be part of this session, Sandra, and deeply honoured to have been asked to participate in this inaugural session. And I just want to say that congratulations again on your 10-year anniversary. And also, if anybody who is there from the donor agencies, please don't forget the women's movement when you're thinking about your next donor cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Imrana. Thanks. Noelene?
I want to say thank you for today, and lovely to see you, Imrana, and everyone online. I think I'm looking forward to looking through the questions and comments as well. And I want to say feminists have a huge amount to contribute to social, economic, and ecological justice discussions, because we'll go into the places where maybe others won't. And that's, if nothing else, that's one reason to put us all on boards and take us into the think tanks and find us the spaces where we can contribute, because you can have some of what you've had today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, Imrana and Noelene. Thank you, everybody online, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Feminist Dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.